Hi, I'm back. Have to find things to practice. There's plenty, I assure you. Okay, so there are a bunch of little trills that could be a disadvantage. I think there's a bunch of double thirds that I know won't be a problem for me, but I do know I will have to remind myself about them. They are roughly measure 158 and on from there. The hands are doubled. There are several ways. Of course, this is groups of 4 ascending notes, so I could go in the right hand 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I don't think I will. I have an old notation that says just stick with the 4 here. I think that's pretty smart, so that's what I'm going to do. And then, so I'm not, whoops. And then, by contrast, I am going to stick with the second finger for these ones that each end on a white note. So I may want to work to clean that up a little bit, but for now what I'm trying to do is flesh out all the places where it really might bug me or where it really might bug my partners when I get to rehearsal on Thursday. So for now I'm going to skip ahead. I'm okay at the coda. I may have to experiment a little bit with fingering, but mostly when I have all these little leaps that are followed by turns, I just want to make sure that after the leap my hand is at ease, that I don't make anything out of an extension for the leaps, because that would put me in a complete quandary when I get to the top, especially for the leaps that happen to be octaves. So I could leap to 5th and then turn my hand. That's perfectly fine. Or I could leap right to the 3rd finger. Usually when I'm trying to figure out whether a fingering like that works, I try to be as casual and unconscious as possible. So looking at the camera, it's easier to do 5th finger because the top note is right there. So I will probably do that. And because I haven't written down any fingering, I'm assuming that that's what I did, because the 3rd finger would be a less standard kind of a fingering, and I probably would have written it down as a reminder of what I had decided. Okay. I don't want to say that's all there is to the first movement. I will, when I have time later, read through it and find out any other problem spots. In the meantime, I want to see what's going on in the other movements. So, scherzo. Now, again, as I pointed out yesterday, when you're playing with a score, that doesn't change the fact that certain things are easier when you're staring at the keyboard. For example, leaps, placement of the hand, especially when you're going from white note to white note and there's not a whole lot of black note orientation or feel. So it's so easy. I can, if I'm really conscious, do all of that accurately without looking at the keyboard. But it's not worth it to not think just a little bit about how to refine it. So it's the sort of place I would be looking at the keyboard. Yeah, I'll just noodle my way through initially. This is not to say that this kind of cursory examination is all there is to it, but rather that in determining how I work ahead, I want to know for sure if there are some really persnickety issues that I have to deal with, as with those triplets and shakes in the first movement. larger, 170, 168 or so. There's a bunch of notes. They're written as eighth notes, 4/8 notes going to a quarter, but they have a shake on the first note. So it's one of those things where what it says and what you do are not necessarily exactly the same thing. For example, if I wanted to make sure that the shake were completed and I started it on the beat, that would only work at a certain tempo. Beyond a certain tempo, the distinction is not really there in the same way. I think we have, in this era, a sense that that scores are to be taken literally in a certain way. I think we've never managed to perfect our notational system to make what it says in the score perfectly determine what the behavior of the interpreter should be. And before now, that certainly was also not the case, but rather a sense that there's a certain gestural freedom, a certain interpretive freedom associated with the way the notation goes. In particular, lengths of notes, for example, 2 repeated notes of the same pitch, say 2 quarter notes in a row. They're written as quarter notes, but we always do, whether we're conscious of it or not. We shorten the first note because you have to come off it to play the second note. Same thing goes for a quarter note that are in disparate places on the keyboard. You have to know that you are always empowered to let go a little bit early. Similarly speaking, ornaments, I call it the tyranny of the ornament, that ornaments tend to push us around and make us feel as if we have to cram a whole bunch of quick little notes in no time. And since no time is never available to us, we always have to have some time. You have to determine what it means for you that more or less validly represents what you think the composer meant. So in the case of, if I'm being as literal as possible, I'd play these 3 notes, and then that would occupy 1 full 8th note. Now, if I'm doing that, but it's much faster, there's a point at which it doesn't make any difference. The most important thing is that the left and the right hand have to align, etc. Okay. I must share with you, just for context about notation, when I lost my, shall I say, rhythmic notational reading innocence was when I saw in a Bach piece 3 notes, triplets, and the first note shared the same note head, because it was the same pitch, with a dotted rhythm in another voice, and then the 16th note, the 3rd note of the one voice, shared the same note head with a triplet. So in other words, Bach was assuming that his dotted rhythm in this case was like a swung rhythm, 1, 2, 3, rather than 1, 2, 3, 4. And as we know about his double dots, similarly, that a dot means whatever it needs to mean. It's an elongation and it's an asymmetry. And when you make discoveries like that, it really is empowering in a way, because you don't feel as if the score is always pushing you around, but rather giving a suggestion or trying to capture some sense of what the composer heard in his or her head. And that's what I try to capture in this kind of a situation. I'm not going to worry about it unduly, in other words. You're welcome to write angry letters. It's okay. Okay, pat, pat, pat. I'm going to assume all is well. 3rd movement, the slow movement. Now, obviously, this is going to be a control thing. On this piano, I'm not going to be able to explore as much as I will on the concert piano. I hope I will have enough time to explore a little bit more there, but this is a sonorous, beautiful thing, and much of the technical involvement will be in making sure that I can make the piano sing. Other things later on, the first episode, there's a lot of triplets coming up after the double bar, which is either rehearsal number Y or measure 26, 27, 28, 29. So, in more or less contrary motion, the The hands are filling in chords. And for those of you who didn't catch what I did, I happened to play in D flat instead of in D. Well, actually, it's too bad in a way, because D flat is much more comfortable under these circumstances. It's one of those things that you make decisions about when you're looking for an appropriate physical choreography, that with the long fingers extended over the black notes and the short fingers on the white notes, it's inherently the way the keyboard was intended to interact with the human hand. But in this case, we actually get the exact opposite, which requires an optimization of how you do things. Because, for example, your fifth finger and your thumb are on the black notes, and your 4 and your 2 are on white notes. So for me, particularly because I have thick fingers that don't stick well between a lot of black notes, I do a lot more moving outward to the fat part of the white note to give myself a sense of comfort, and then to deliver myself back to the thumb. So, D major, E minor, now I find it interesting, I haven't written any fingerings in here. Here's a rather odd leap from F sharp to E. These other ones are well accommodated by an adjustment of fingering, like at the top of this. To go from 4 to 5 is delicious. I can go to 2 here. It doesn't much matter, because I'm going to carry my hand, I'm going to make my arm start the A major arpeggio with a sense of ease and not with a feeling of frenzy. Same principle here. I've got a whole octave lead. As it happens, that my cello partner, Mary Peckham, isn't playing after this lead. She rejoins me. It's her melody. And she rejoins me on that downbeat, so I may ask her for a little time there. Here I do have I see I've notated the grouping. So even though these are written in triplets, if I think of them executionally in triplets, they're much harder than if I simply recognize I can look at them differently and see them as a series of broken descending octaves. So that's what I would do. A group of 2, a group of 2, a group of 2, and all is well with the world. And when it goes into intervals, it's interesting. It actually makes the point that much more, because they're written as portati. So they're non-legato, and your hand does not need to reach from place to place. You just move comfortably from hand position, whatever works well, and so on. So I'm going to pass on by until I have time to refine it a little more. So, a series of variations. Mark, this is at 65. Marked sempre staccato. And this is something that I stress to myself and to my students, that I really think of staccato and legato and non-legato and portato and all of those things as being on a sort of a continuum, that you can reach from the most legato or even overlapping legatissimo to the sharpest kind of staccato. And if you start off with an appropriate gesture that links the notes, in other words, if you think linearly and choreographically first, and then worry about the articulation second, you will usually find an easier way of doing it. So if I go, I'll have to check later whether, in fact, my left hand is in camera, but if I emphasize too much the up and downedness of of many beginning pianists who look at staccato and think hot potato or hot stove. The risk is that I put a great deal of effort into it. If instead I find a gestural simplicity to it, and then I can refine the articulation to suit my needs. So, I just turn that into that. The basic gesture feels very, very similar between legato and staccato when you're playing quickly like that. And again, grouping has such an enormous impact on your confidence level. For example, here I have a A major arpeggio, and a scalar fragment here. So if I include the scalar fragment in the arpeggio, rather than feeling that I've concluded a simple arpeggio followed by a scale, it makes life much more difficult for myself than necessary. No big deal, especially because it's non-legato. So I get to the E, I play a 4-note descending arpeggio, and a 4-note descending scale. Okay, so far so good. This seems reasonable. There's going to be repeated chords. Whoops. Wrong clef. That doesn't help. Interesting. For repeated things, repeated notes, repeated chords, I virtually never play with the same point of impact on the key. I'm always moving elsewhere. I'm moving in, moving out, moving left, moving right, da, 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 da. And it depends, of course, where my ultimate releasing note may be. And so on. So again, I'm going to assume that when it's time to clean it up, I'll be able to do so. Moving on to the poco più adagio, which is measure 113 or so. It's got the melody has been placed offbeat by 1/16th note. So we have an 8th note representation of the melodic line, but it's meanwhile, one of those places where what the piano is doing is just providing a texture. There's an awful lot of notes, as you may be able to see, either on your score or mine. It's non-stop 30-second notes in the left hand, and finally the hands double, and they both play 30-second notes. It's not designed to show off a bunch of virtuosity. It's textural. It has to have a sense of ease. So the job of the pianist in this case is to learn it so as to hide it in essence, to have it provide a cushion for the sound above in the other three parts. That requires then a real sense of simplicity. Any excessively fingery stuff will create a verticality, will create a noisiness, make it very difficult to play either at tempo or at an appropriate dynamic level, which is here piano. And since the string players are marked piano and the right hand of the piano is also playing in octaves, the left hand should probably be significantly less than piano. And of course, the busyness of motion will tend to make it much louder than it ought to be. So there needs to be a recognition that a lot of the gesture goes along the keys rather than into the keys. So the momentum of the gesture carries along, is dissipated along the key. That requires choreographic simplicity. I have very vaguely written some fingering suggestions. As you notice, But typically when I go to an isolated fifth finger, I'm almost always approach it from the body to the keyboard. It's a much easier gesture. At some point, remind me, I will talk about what I call the Federal Express delivery system. I'll remind myself that I'm using that. Okay. Supposedly, the guy who invented Federal Express used it as his master's thesis, that he invented this idea of a hub, which started off as Little Rock, Arkansas, and ended up in reality being Memphis, that he found it would be both more cost-effective and time-effective to amass packages without regard to their final destination and send them all to one big sorting facility, which ended up being Memphis. And then in the big sorting facility, packages from all over the country could be amassed for each of the individual larger destinations and put on planes and sent out relatively quickly. His point was that it would be both more time-effective and cost-effective to do so, and a lot of people thought that was illogical. But it works. So we have not only Federal Express and most delivery systems with hubs now, but we also have passenger airlines doing the same thing. Similarly speaking, I think pianists make a big mistake when they try to find straight lines between diverse points on the keyboard. I find that organically speaking, it's much easier to move the arms as if from a hub, from the center of your body towards various places on the keyboard. You can move much more quickly this way because it's optimized for the kind of rotational gestures the body is equipped to deal with. So in a case like this, there's an awful lot of in and out language associated with making it work. And that's what I'm looking for here, is just the appropriate ways of being accurate. Now, again, the issue of eyes, am I going to have to look at those? Some of them, yes, or maybe. Not a whole lot. I'm experienced enough that I can play much of this without looking. I could probably even practice it with my eyes closed if necessary. But it brings up the other issue, and that is that if you're spending a lot of time on your right hand, or at least you're spending a lot of attention on your right hand, your left hand is going to get short shrift and you're probably going to start missing. So it's one of those things where you have to choose where your attention goes. It's what I call the choreography of attention, that at any given moment your attention goes wherever it needs to go, which is very often where there are bigger leaps or more awkward placements of the hand on the keyboard or things of that sort. And very often, surprisingly, it will go on to a subordinate voice that happens to be more awkwardly written or written in a more challenging fashion. So that means if my ear says, please notice the right hand, and I spend all my time noticing it, I'm likely to mess up in the left hand. So I know in advance that I've got to know the right hand well enough, or find cues in the music that give me enough of a sense of where the right hand is going, so I don't have to concentrate on it most of the time. I can hear how I'm doing, I can bring it out, but I have to spend most of my attention being accurate in the left. So this is one of those places where, although separate hand work is very useful, it's also useful to know up front to what extent you will be able to rely on putting your attention in one place or the other. So. Interestingly enough, when it starts to double, although it would seem to be more difficult, it's actually much easier. First of all, because the hands are doing the same thing. Therefore, one hand or the other can lead, the other hand will follow more directly. It's just mentally simpler to do as well as being physically simpler to do. You'll notice a couple of times I hesitated a fair amount in working out the other things. I mentioned that yesterday, that the principle of the mental breath, of mustering up your forces, of telling yourself precisely the nature of what notes you're going to, what sensation you expect, what sonority you expect, is very important. Okay, so I'm going to meander around. It's going to do it again in rehearsal number B. And so on. So I'm going to come back to it. Again, I'm still looking for places of horror, because there's always that risk. Okay, so I am heading for the last movement. No, I'm not. I'm in measure 96 of the third movement, where actually this is a transition. It goes into the last movement. It's an attacca. And so I don't know why I wrote measure 96, but it's measure 1 of the last movement. So allegro molto, moderato. It's very cute what Beethoven does. You know, a lot of pieces that have a nickname that we associate with are fantastically elevating in one point, in one fashion or another. For example, the nobility of the opening of this piece and a lot of the beautiful things that happen, which makes the sort of wonderful lightness and ease and humor of the last movement that much more remarkable, that he's not, in this case, being profound. He's being in, what can I call it, joy mode. So anyway, there's a lot of notes here, but the point of them is to make them not sound like a lot of notes. Let's see. So is a trill. Could be 2 notes, or 3 notes, could be 4 notes. I'm alone, so it depends what I want to do. Now again, he's got 16th notes and quintuplet, that's 7 notes. Now the last thing I want to do is be mathematical and say, these 2, then these 5. Rather, I think of it as a 7, maybe that I start a little more slowly. So it becomes quite easy. Now, one of the biggest traps would be for a less experienced pianist to keep your hand over all the keys rather than to move in accordance with where the resistance is or isn't. And particularly, I want to release on that. Now, the left hand again is not hard, but it does have leaps, so I have to be careful. I'm aware I could look to be sure I get all the B flats, or the other thing I can do, which I like to point out, is that on the piano, the durations of notes allow you a combination of events. You can either be holding that note as long as the duration indicates, or you can be leaving that note early for some travel time. In this case, you need the travel time. You can't get from 8th note to 8th note without rest in between, even though it's not written. So if I'm just aware of the amount of travel time necessary, fingerings that I pondered over as I executed Okay, so here is a good example of something where going from the single note passage to the chord requires that you let go if you want to be really at ease. If you try to connect it, well, actually you can't connect it because in this case, in all of these cases, there's a repeated note. So you may as well let go with a good sense of release. And if you want to move your hand over so much, that's fine too. Okay, so here I see I've taken the time to indicate fingerings. Third finger when I have a 3-note group that ends on a white note. 4 when I have a 3-note group that ends on a black note. 4 when I have a... Well, here's one. I'm going 3, 4, 3, 4, 3. I could just as easily do 3 there. 4 I need here, or I want, on the ones that end on black notes. So I'm having a bit of a war with myself, with my past self. I might just prefer this 3. 3, 3, 3, 4, 3, 3, 3, 4, 3, 4. Whoops. Whoop. This is a perfect example of my big hand getting in the way. If I don't have the right angle for this B flat chord, and I need to find it quickly, I'm going to get a smoosh of extra notes. So I have to tilt my hand slightly, I have to release the keyboard, and then I have it. Okay. I'll have to ponder that. The fourth finger here, I'm going to write 3 in parentheses just so I can come back to it and ponder which one works best for me. Now, again, I'm not sure what measure this is. You can work it out for yourself. Where we have these pseudo dotted rhythms with rests instead. There's a slur from there. It's a silly thing. The slur is not an under the hand slur, rather a sense of musical joining. And there's a sforzando anyway on the downbeat. So I'm looking for comfort in the only, it's a 5-note chord in my right hand. This F7 chord. So I'm playing 4th finger on the B flat in the right hand, and then I'm moving to 3, 4, 5. I'm comfortable here and I'm comfortable here. So in essence, by optimizing both positions, it's easy enough to connect them by just going for it, letting my arm be free, letting my hand be comfortable. See visible there. Okay. Whoops. Same kind of principle. Trill and then toss to the octave. A reminder to start my left hand scale with the 3rd finger, so I'm ready to standard B flat scale fingering. Okay. Okay, so again, the only challenge here is in these little leaps. White note octaves. I always want to make sure when I have several white notes in a row, I use the principle of what I call the virtual or the invented black note. In other words, one of these two should feel more like a black note. I love to practice with substitute notes. For example, if I know that going from white to white is a difficult gesture, I try it going from white to black. And if I notice that there's an inherently more comfortable gesture then I simply substitute that sense for when I'm going white to white. So it feels like going white to black. I'm going in on it. And again, it's one of those things with all those white notes that even though this is music that I'm going to perform from the music, this is one instance where it's dangerous. I may do that. It's not that I can't do it, but it's a little bit more of a look, makes a lot more of security. So, I'm going to glance ahead and see if there's anything significantly more problematical. Measure 100 is more of this stuff. And then what comes up shortly thereafter, 100, 1, 2, 3, 4. You notice that the last interval is getting bigger. Oops. So you have to decide, what does that last note belong with? It's either the last note as it's written, or it's the note, an anacrusic note preceding the next B flat. And so on. So, this is again one of those things where I probably want to be looking at the keyboard. Yeah, I noticed that from how quickly it's coming back that even though it's not perfect now, there's a sense of ease about the gesture. So the basic fleshing out is what I'm after now. That's the specific place I am in, shall we say, developmentally in this piece, is recapturing some of what I had before and just reminding myself what works and what is necessary. What are some of the necessary ingredients of what I concentrate on? So, bunch of this is in the area of 160, a whole bunch of broken octaves, a lot of them repeated. Part of this is in grouping, because for example, in 161, 2, 3, 4, although these are threes, this is in 6, dot, 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 dot. The change happens halfway through the first beat. So, conceptually and physically, it's a lot easier to divide it that way and to think starting fresh on the E flat and then tossing back to the B flat. Okay, much of that will be pretty straightforward. Presto, 169 and on. Well, starts with a trill. Well, I'm marking time. My partners are going like crazy. They're going. And so on. I've got to start playing that soon enough. So, my turn. I've got stuff to do. When we get back to B flat, we were temporarily in Pinky Beethoven. Now we're, so I'm doing a bunch of triplets. Now I know it's going to be fast, I know it's going to be light. Not a big deal. Particularly because it's not a fingery thing, it's much more gestural, going to the thumb over and over, so there's a really lovely sense of hand fit. And so on. And what I did then is just remind myself of the nature of the chromaticism. You notice how the hands are moving in essence in opposition to one another, that the left hand plays black, the right hand plays black, the left hand plays black, the right hand goes black. So once I'm aware of that physically, that gesture is part of what gives me a greater sense of flow in that passage, in that specific spot. So it's going to go on like that. Beethoven starts to add little sforzandi, which are kind of fun. Not only marked sforzando, but marked with a dot. So it's a reminder too for me that letting go is imperative. You could go crazy working out a legato-like fingering where you tried to turn. It's a complete waste of time. What you want is a sense of ease. What I will often do to note whether or not something is going to work, not note that it's working entirely, but just go for broke. Go to a concert tempo. Whoops. And just find out if my body responds to it, if I know that even though I've only got 3 or 6 or however many notes, that because there's a sense of ease and simplicity about the gestural language and clarity in the oral language, I know I'm on the right track. Even here, for example, it's what would be normally a peculiar fingering, to finish on the thumb and then to go to another note down there very quickly, but there's plenty of time for it. How do I know that? Because I try it out and I find that. So I'm trying to figure out why I wrote 2 to 1, and that's exactly why, because it works. Okay, that makes me pass on by and say, okay, I'm in good shape there. Okay, so here's one of those places where I redivide Beethoven. At the più presto, which is just a cluster of measures before the end, there's suddenly it's written this way, octave in the left hand, and then the 2 hands do this. The problem is it's all written as non-stop 8th notes. Now I could, of course, go, but I'm just not 100% comfortable waiting for that. What I really want is a shout, an energy that impels this figure forward. And I don't want to have to spend a lot of time placing my hand. So what I do is I redivide them. I play the first 3 notes in my right hand, the first top notes, only one hand in the left hand. What's the result? Well, I've got 3/4 of the placement of the ensuing notes available. Then I only have to go from B flat to B flat in my left hand. The result is it's faster, it's much more dependable. Same for here. And again, I need to move my arm. That's how it ends. Now, that goes faster too, but it's all in B flat. Doesn't feel as if it's going to be a problem because every group of 2, I have a sense of ease in the gesture. That means putting them together will not be a big deal. Whether I have to play them from memory or not, it's not the issue. It's that I know already that the fleshing out is working so that I'm on my way. Okay, I'll stop for now.